Hello, scholars. This is Mr. Myers. Today we're going to talk about how a bill becomes a law, lesson 2.7. Make sure you take good structured notes over the objectives. We'll talk about the process of how a bill becomes a law, tactics to pass and block bills, vetoes and what those look like, and then special events related to legislation. Okay, so how does a bill become a law? Back to our Schoolhouse Rock days. So it starts with someone having an idea, and those ideas can come from lots of different places. They can come from citizens like you or I. They could come from the legislators themselves. They could come from interest groups, such as like Mothers Against Drunk Driving or the American Medical Association, or they could come from the president. Think FDR and the New Deal or Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. So the bill will be formally sponsored by someone who will introduce it into the House or the Senate. Sometimes it's favorable to get a co-sponsor of the bill. More than one person can sponsor a bill. And if you have someone from the other party co-sponsoring a bill, making it more bipartisan, it can sometimes be easier to get a bill passed. Once the bill has formally been introduced, it will be assigned likely to a standing committee, and then from there, likely assigned to a subcommittee of that standing committee. Now, it's important to remember, and I've already said this once, that the vast majority of the nitty-gritty of legislating, making and amending laws happens in subcommittee. It's much easier to work out the details of very complicated pieces of legislation in small groups. Now, there are a good number of bills that will actually never be discussed in subcommittee because they're pigeonholed by the committee chairperson at the very beginning. And basically, what that means is that the chairperson of that committee refuses to even discuss or debate that bill. And it's not uncommon for bills to be killed in this way, they're just simply pigeonholed. The other bills that get killed will be discussed and possibly even amended and then voted down. Now, if a bill isn't pigeonholed or voted down and it's passed out of committee, it can be done in one of two ways. It can be passed out of committee favorably, which means that it has kind of the committee's seal of approval, or it can be passed out of committee unfavorably, which basically means that the committee doesn't want to be responsible for killing the bill. Perhaps it's a relatively popular one, but the committee wants to basically say, we don't like this bill. We know it's popular. We're going to go ahead and let it go to the House or Senate floor for debate, but we're not happy about it. If the bill then is lucky enough to make it out of committee, it would go to what's called the Committee of the Whole, and basically what that is the full House or the full Senate floor, where any representative or senator can then discuss, debate, and propose amendments to that bill. A simple majority will approve that bill and send it to the other chamber where the process would start all over again. Okay, a couple other things about this process. So a bill can start in either the House or the Senate. It doesn't matter unless it's an appropriations or a tax bill. It has to start in the House if that's the case. But it can start in either one if it's not a tax bill. Once the bill is passed, it has to be passed in identical form in both houses. So if there are two different versions, the House passes a version that's slightly different than the Senate bill, they would have to iron out those differences in conference committee, and that's where representatives of both the House and the Senate would get together and iron out those differences so that an identical bill could be sent back to both the House and the Senate for final passage, and then from there to the President for either signature or veto. A quick word about voting. So you can see on the right there's different types of voting that happens on the floor of the House and the Senate. A lot of times there are procedural votes, very simple little votes about whether or not to extend debate or to stop for lunch or whatever the case might be. And oftentimes those are done with voice vote, a simple aye or no, and then whoever is the speaker or in charge of the floor would simply say that the motion carries or the motion doesn't. Sometimes they might do a division, which basically means that they're going to be stand-in counted, but on important pieces of legislation, you would want a electronic recorded vote, and that way the constituents have a record of how your congressperson voted on various bills, and that can be an important factor in determining whether or not a constituent wants to vote for that person for re-election or vote them out of office. So I want you to pause and recreate this flow chart. I think this is going to be an important tool to help you remember how a bill becomes a law. You need to know everything on this slide and the next slide. The only difference that you're going to note between the House and the Senate versions of how a bill becomes a law is that extra step on the bottom left of this slide. You can see that once a bill passes out of committee, before it goes to the Committee of the Whole in the House, it has to go to a Rules Committee. And that basically is because there are so many more members of the House of Representatives that they have to limit debate and establish rules for that debate. In the Senate, the rules are much more lax. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Here's the second half of the flow chart. Again, you see the Rules Committee in the top left of your slide. The rest of this is identical. It would go to floor action, and on the floor of the House or the Senate, they would debate, sometimes adding amendments, but usually most amendments and nitty-gritty of the lawmaking is done in subcommittee. From the floor action, it would be voted out. It would go to a conference committee if there are different versions between the House and the Senate bills, back to the House and the Senate for final passage, and then to the President for signature or veto. And if you really want to get into the weeds, you can check out this really cool infographic. I put a link to it in the description underneath the video, and feel free to click on it and kind of play around. You can see that the lawmaking process is actually a little bit more complicated than the version I gave you. Now on to some tactics to help either pass bills or to kill bills. The first two tactics we're going to look at are tactics to help pass bills. The first one is called lobbying. Lobbying simply refers to trying to influence a legislator to vote for a particular piece of legislation or to vote against a particular piece of legislation. Lobbying can be done by anybody. It has its historical origins in the fact that constituents used to meet representatives in the lobby of the House of Representatives after they got off the floor. As they're leaving the chamber, they would be greeted by people who wanted to bend their ear about something or try to influence them about a particular piece of legislation. So lobbying refers to literally in the lobby of the House of Representatives trying to influence a congressman to vote a particular way. Lobbying can be done by individual citizens. Lobbying is most often done through paid lobbyists who tend to represent particular special interest groups, right? So the NRA, the National Rifle Association, will pay people to professionally lobby Congress about pro-gun legislation, right? Or the American Medical Association might lobby Congress about best practice in terms of patient care. The next tactic is referred to as log rolling. Log rolling refers to back in the day when you would get a new farm and you would clear off all of your trees, your neighbors would come help you roll all the logs off of the land so that you could plant crops. It's basically a way to help a neighbor. It refers to this idea of reciprocity, this idea that if you help me, I'll help you. If you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. If you support my piece of legislation, I will support a piece of legislation that you care about. This idea of reciprocity, of helping each other out in exchange for support at a future date or on a future issue or a different issue rather, is absolutely critical to getting things done. It's probably the single most important way that any legislation gets passed, since majorities tend to be pretty narrow and you have to rely on other people to get legislation passed. The next thing that we're going to talk about is a filibuster. A filibuster is a way to kill a bill or to prevent a bill from being passed. It can only be done in the Senate. A filibuster is a Senate-specific thing. In the Senate, they don't have rules for how long someone can speak once they've been given the floor. So if you've been recognized and been given the microphone and have the ability to speak, you can stand and speak as long as you want. And while that happens, no votes can take place on the Senate floor. The term filibuster actually has an interesting origin. It's a pirate term. The idea of a filibuster is the idea of taking booty or taking treasure. And the way I like to think about this process is that when someone is going to filibuster in the Senate, they're kind of, like a pirate hijacking the process and preventing any legislation that's been building up from being voted on. And if a filibuster is started at the end of a session when there are all of these bills that are desperate to get out of committee and get voted on, remember that if the session ends and those bills aren't voted on, they have to start all over again. They have to get reintroduced and all of that. So there's an enormous amount of pressure at the end of a legislative session to try to make sure that that legislation ultimately gets passed. And so when you have the floor and you can prevent that, you have some leverage and some negotiating power that you can use with your fellow senators to try to get them to change more particular, controversial aspects of the bill or to even kill it. Now, a couple things that I want you to know historically about filibusters. First of all, that historically they have been used disproportionately to stop civil rights legislation. The longest filibuster in American history was actually a tag team filibuster where for 60 straight days, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was tried to be blocked by Southern conservative Democrats. Eventually, a cloture vote, as you can see in this newspaper headline, was done, and the Civil Rights Act of 64 was ultimately passed. So that was the longest multi-person filibuster filibuster. The longest individual filibuster up until a month or two ago was Strom Thurmond, who was protesting the Civil Rights Act of 1957. He spoke for about 24 hours, and he reportedly went to the sauna, tried to dehydrate himself so that he wouldn't have to go to the bathroom, had his wife pack some extra food for him, and this was, kind of considered a marathon session. Very recently, Cory Booker, in protest of what he considers anti-democratic measures taken by Donald Trump, set the new individual record at 25 hours and 5 minutes. So it's important to remember that speech doesn't have to be germane or relevant to the bill that's actually being discussed, so you can get up there and talk about whatever you want. Huey Long, nicknamed the Kingfish, a famous senator from Louisiana, once got up and read his favorite fried oyster recipes, and then read names and phone numbers out of a telephone book. Ted Cruz, 5 or 10 years ago, read Dr. Seuss books on the Senate floor. So you do get some weird things that are said and spoken on the Senate floor. Now, another way to destroy or kill a bill is to add a poison pill amendment. This can only be done in the Senate because amendments have to be germane in the House, meaning that any amendments to the bill have to be relevant to the bill. But in the Senate, you could put like an abortion amendment on a transportation bill, and if that amendment is particularly unpopular, it could be a reason to vote against the bill. So that's why it's referred to sometimes as a poison pill. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about vetoes. So, a veto is an important check that the executive has over the legislative branch, and it's given in Article 1, Section 7. A veto will formally kill a bill, and there's a couple different ways to do that. One is just a straight veto. The president simply issues a veto. The other one is a pocket veto, and these don't happen anymore, but the basic idea is if there was less than 10 days in a term, and the president does nothing or just like puts the bill in his pocket, so to speak, the bill would die. And that was historically to prevent a bunch of bad legislation from being passed at the very end of a term and then thrown to the president, and then Congress kind of leaves. Realistically, pocket vetoes don't happen anymore, so you don't really need to worry about it. The other two are ways that a bill can become a law. One is if there's more than 10 days left in a term of Congress and the president doesn't sign it, it becomes law. And that might happen if the bill is popular among the people, but the president doesn't particularly like it and doesn't want to endorse, a particular bill, but wants to allow it to become law. And the other way is to sign it into law. Option 1 and Option 4 are the two most common things, either a straight veto or straight signing the bill. You can also see sometimes that vetoes can get overridden. You need 2/3 vote in both houses. That doesn't happen very often. Threats of a veto can also be very effective. It can force changes to legislation just like a threat of a filibuster. And the use of the veto has increased over time. Back in the day, it was very, very controversial for the president to veto a piece of legislation simply because he or she didn't like it. Today, it's very, very common. A couple other special circumstances you need to be familiar with. We've already mentioned that bills of revenue, bills that deal with taxes or appropriations, basically if it deals with money, it has to start in the House of Representatives. Another thing you need to be familiar with is the concept of raising the debt limit. Raising the debt limit allows for more borrowing and spending for the government, and of course that can be lowered or raised. The key thing to understand is that if the government has already spent that money, we have to pay it back or our credit gets downgraded globally, and that would be really horrible for both the United States and the rest of the world. Very recently, Speaker McCarthy and President Biden issued a 2-year deal to raise the debt limit. This has been used as a political tool recently and increasingly has become a cudgel that can be used to force concessions by the president. It's not really good practice because we've already spent that money. We have to pay it back. But hopefully, over the next couple of years, at least, we don't have to worry about raising the debt limit. Ironically, if debt limit deals aren't reached and we have a budget shutdown, it actually ends up costing the government money, which isn't good for anyone. So it's always best for Dems and Pubs to get together and figure out a way to fund the government. Okay, so I know we spend a little bit more time on this topic than other topics, but it's a pretty important one, so I think that's okay. Make sure you bring any questions to class.